camped out on a California sidewalk. Reporters shouted a man's name like an accusation, while an army of lenses gathered to wait for a single unguarded expression they could sell. Vans lined the road leading to the courthouse. Satellite dishes pointed at the sky, turning one family's private nightmare into a daily, inescapable television broadcast. Inside, one seat over from the defendant, Katherine Jackson sat perfectly still. She watched strangers weigh the character of her son in real time. She had spent her life anchoring this family. Long before the cameras arrived, she navigated poverty in Gary, Indiana, keeping her children grounded through the earliest, leanest years. When a record deal finally materialized, she held them together through a sudden, blinding fame that swallowed their childhood whole. For decades, she absorbed the collateral damage of that spotlight. She watched magazines invent fictional versions of the boys she raised, quietly enduring the slow erosion of ordinary family life. The public devoured the polished stage acts and the matching suits. Katherine, meanwhile, never changed her name, never chased her own spotlight, and never forgot who her children actually were underneath the performance. By the time the trial began, the media apparatus had spent 20 years running on a very specific fuel. It demanded extremity, it ignored context entirely, and rewarded whatever headline caused the most damage. Day after day, Michael Jackson sat at the defense table, visibly hollowing out. He was forced to listen as people debated his humanity on live television, knowing the cameras outside were hungry for any sign of collapse. The verdict arrived in June. The jury heard everything the prosecution brought and acquitted him cleanly, on all 14 counts. But a courtroom door closing doesn't sound like a victory. Away from the flashing lights, the immediate aftermath was heavy, quiet, and entirely exhausted. Surviving months of relentless public dissection extracts a permanent physical and emotional cost. The law recognized his innocence, but the ordeal itself left him drained of the ability to simply exist in public without a seal. An innocent verdict proves a legal fact, but it doesn't erase what the public has read. The headlines that defined him in the public imagination were already printed, and they were never going to run front-page retractions. At that moment, he was one of the most recognized human beings alive. He had lawyers, publicists, and an entire global industry of reputation management at his disposal. Yet none of those tools could actually fix what had been broken. Press statements and carefully timed interviews manage narratives. They don't repair the deep human wreckage left behind by decades of microscopic scrutiny. Outside the courthouse, the satellite dishes began to come down. The same vans that had broadcast his nightmare for months simply packed up their cables and drove off to find the next story. Inside, the publicists faded away, leaving a son sitting in an isolated room with his mother. In that private space, the reality set in. No legal victory or PR campaign would ever be enough to restore their image. The answer had to come from somewhere else entirely. He spoke to her quietly, making a promise the public never heard. He wouldn't let strangers write the final chapter of their legacy. Refusing to rely on publicists, he placed faith in the family itself, vowing someone who shared their DNA would restore their story. He made that vow without knowing who would carry it out, and he wouldn't live long enough to see if it would ever be kept. 15 years went by. Then, after a massive global casting search, a 29-year-old nephew walked onto a movie set. Jaafar Jackson put on his uncle's red leather jacket. He stepped into the frame, physically carrying the weight of that unfulfilled promise, taking their story back from the cameras. Decades after she sat perfectly still in that California courtroom, Katherine Jackson finally got to sit in a darkened theater, watching the vow her son made to her come to life on screen. A family's history isn't saved by press releases or courtroom verdicts. It survives because a mother endures the worst of the storm, and because the bloodline she protected chooses to carry it forward. In June 2009, Katherine Jackson was handed an impossible responsibility. She had already buried one son, and now, in the chaotic aftermath of Michael's cashing, she stepped back into the role she'd occupied for 6 decades, holding a devastated family together. But a family that public is denied the quiet required to mourn. Every attempt to process their loss was interrupted by the flash of cameras and the relentless demands of a global media apparatus. Every legal dispute over the estate generated fresh headlines, Every anniversary brought a new wave of camera crews, filtering the family's grief through an industry that had spent decades deciding which version of Michael Jackson was the most profitable to print. This public spectacle hijacked the narrative. The peace the 2005 acquittal was supposed to restore remained out of reach forever, and control over his legacy was effectively surrendered to outsiders. For years, the concept of an authorized film about his life lingered in development hell. Projects were announced, scripts were drafted, and then, quietly, they were shelved. The Jackson estate is notoriously protective, and for good reason. They rejected the idea of handing the narrative over to studio executives or screenwriters whose only connection to the material was archival footage. The family understood exactly what happens when someone else holds the pen. Doing this properly required a perspective that instinctively grasped the crushing weight attached to that name. It required a successor from inside the bloodline, someone who didn't yet realize he was about to be asked to carry it. In 2020, producer Graham King contacted a young man named Jaafar Jackson. He was Michael's nephew, a name completely unknown to the general public, and he was being asked to audition for a film that didn't even have a finished script. There was no casting panel or sterile Hollywood waiting room. Jaafar found a quiet space, got into character, and recorded a simple, untrained voice note, sending it off into the unknown. When he landed the role, his immediate reaction was startling. He chose absolute silence. For a full year, he kept the monumental news entirely to himself. He hid his preparation from everyone, including his father, Jermaine, the brother who grew up alongside Michael and knew him more intimately than almost anyone alive. He needed to test himself first. He knew the immense expectation his grieving family would place on his shoulders, so he chose to weather the risk of failure alone rather than expose them to a false hope. When production finally began, Jaafar moved into Hayvenhurst, the family compound in Encino. He rotated through the different bedrooms, sleeping in a new space every few nights. He was trying to physically absorb the unglamorous, everyday atmosphere of the house his uncle grew up in. Inside those walls, he built a dedicated research room. He mapped out decades of his uncle's career, cross-referencing the music milestones with major historical events to understand exactly what the world was doing around him. 2 years of rigorous training followed. He worked directly alongside original choreographers from the History World Tour, professionals who demanded absolute perfection and knew exactly when a movement was slightly off. This was an attempt to absorb a ghost. He was methodically taking on the physical and emotional weight of a lost relative, entirely without the safety net of an audience. The ultimate test of this training was the Motown 25 performance of Billie Jean. Every movement of that legendary routine had to be broken down and reconstructed frame by frame. The demand for exactness took a brutal physical toll. He rehearsed until his feet went numb, pushing through routines until they bled. Exhaustion brought crippling doubt. There were mornings he woke up in such intense pain he genuinely questioned if he could walk back into the studio. In those specific moments, he leaned on 4 words his uncle was known to say when the pain was at its worst. "Let's go again." The bloody feet and the exhaustion were mandatory sacrifices. Bypassing a mere imitation required an agonizing physical transformation. Contrast this intense private suffering with the deafening media circus of 2009. That extreme secrecy became his primary defense mechanism against the chaos. This grueling 2-year process was never about securing Hollywood validation or simply putting on a costume impressive. By entirely bypassing the public eye, he stripped the media machine of its power. He reclaimed the narrative through undeniable, meticulous execution. His isolation guaranteed that the work remained pure, untainted by outside interference or the crushing expectations of the tabloids. The result of that isolation is a precise recreation of the presence the world had memorized. Every studied gesture and mirrored movement works to bring the man back into focus. When Jaafar was finally revealed in character, it signaled the fulfillment of a long-delayed family goal. The story was back in their hands, finally being told from the inside. It is an uncanny continuation of the bloodline, a nephew standing in his uncle's silhouette, having spent years aligning his own cadence and movement to a legacy the world nearly took from them. Jaafar rebuilt the connection to the uncle he had lost, doing so one bloodied rehearsal at a time, until the story belonged to the family once again. Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp the sheer weight of what happened, I want you to just imagine for a second that you're sitting in a darkened movie theater, April 2026. The screen lights up, and suddenly you're witnessing something that goes way, way beyond a standard Hollywood premiere. Because, well, some promises aren't kept with words. What that audience was actually seeing was the living, breathing culmination of a completely silent, unrecorded oath made decades earlier. Section 1. The Setup. The Quiet Promise of 2005. Let's step away from the blinding flash bulbs and that absolutely deafening tabloid noise of the era. Think about the exhausted aftermath of that 2005 trial. Michael knew he couldn't magically control the headlines, right? He couldn't just undo years of public dismantling with a single verdict. So, how do you defend a legacy when the entire world is shouting at you? Well, not with another lawsuit, and definitely not with some sterile PR statement. Instead, he made a private, quiet commitment to his family. He promised his mom, Katherine, that his true legacy, the truth of who he really was, would survive, carried forward by his family, not by institutions. Moving right along to Section 2, the prophecy, reclaiming the visual shorthand. So jump forward to the massive marketing campaign for the April 2026 biopic. To announce this film to the world, the studio leaned on one very specific, powerful visual prophecy, Jaafar Jackson, Michael's nephew, Jermaine's son, fully in character. He's wearing that unmistakable red leather beaded jacket, the aviator sunglasses catching the light, rocking that defiant half-smile. This wasn't just some costume department checking a box. Putting Jermaine's boy in that exact jacket was incredibly deliberate. It was the family placing their own flesh and blood right inside the ultimate symbol of the real Michael. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what the stakes were. On one side, you've got the tabloid version, this courtroom caricature built out of pure speculation that had been endlessly recycled for decades. But on the other side, you have the artist. Putting Jaafar in that red jacket visually rejected all that noise. It completely reclaimed the true artist that Katherine always saw underneath 40 years of public distortion. Without a single press release, it basically said, this is who he actually was. Pause for a second, though. Why does a promise like this actually matter? Think about the immense emotional weight here. When your entire life is being dismantled publicly, your first instinct is to fight back loudly, isn't it? But choosing to hold on to a silent truth? Choosing to just patiently protect it instead of screaming it into a microphone? That takes an unbelievable amount of restraint and faith. Section 3. The Sacrifice. Preparation in complete silence. So the crucial point is, for a quiet prophecy to actually mean anything, someone has to step up and do the work. And the unforced dedication it took from his nephew to fulfill this is staggering. 15. That's the number of years Katherine Jackson carried this unfinished promise. 15 years is an extraordinarily long time to wait. She carried it through her son's death, through the guardianship of his kids, and through endless distorted headlines where she had to watch his legacy get warped when he wasn't even there to defend it. Look at how this journey actually unfolded. You've got that quiet promise made back in 2005. Then, from 2009 to 2025, there's just this incredibly long period of uncertain waiting. It's not like anyone was consciously orchestrating some grand master plan, you know? But over those uncertain years, the right person simply grew up. Jaafar grew up within that sprawling family, eventually ready to take on this massive, massive responsibility. The physical and emotional preparation here was just unbelievable. Jaafar spent a secret year in silent training. He literally moved into the house his uncle was raised in, sleeping in different rooms as if he was trying to absorb the memories right out of the walls. He read private words meant for no one else. He bled through rehearsals until a 1983 performance completely lived inside his own body. And he did this instinctively, not because a contract required it, but because he quietly understood exactly what was being asked of him. Which brings us to Section 4, the fulfillment, impact in a darkened theater. Let's step right back into that April 2026 premiere. The room is packed with strangers who think they're just there to watch a movie, but the reality playing out is an emotional climax literally decades in the making. Up on that screen was a family's face, being carried back into a world that had spent so long distorting it. When Jaafar's own mother first saw on screen, wow. So as to say, she was completely overwhelmed. In that moment, she actually struggled to separate the performance of her son from the brother-in-law she had known. It had to be one of the most intense moments of her life. Watching her own child summon her brother-in-law back into existence, breathing, dancing, exactly as if no time had passed at all. That's the sheer emotional shock of seeing the family's literal blood resurrecting Michael so flawlessly. It basically erased decades of tabloid noise in an instant. And if that was the reaction from Jaafar's mom, we really have to think about Katherine Jackson. She's sitting right there in that same darkened audience, a mother who had waited 15 patient, unbearable years. Watching her grandson step into that red leather jacket, she was finally receiving the answer to the quiet promise her son made all those years ago. Now, what's really interesting about this is what it teaches us about truth. It proves that truth doesn't always need this loud, aggressive public defense. Sometimes it literally just needs patient protection by the people who actually knew you. It needs to be handed to the right person at exactly the right time and finished quietly, without any fanfare. Which leaves us with this. The biopic isn't just behind-the-scenes Hollywood trivia. It is a profound testament to family loyalty, showing us how true legacies ultimately outlive the noise. So I leave you with this final thought. If promises aren't kept with words, who will show up for your legacy? Thank you so much for joining me on today's Explainer. I hope this completely changes how you view this incredible piece of history. Catch you next time.